if May, it's the 96th meeting of the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We're going to go a little bit out of order because Ms. Damoff, with the gracious consent of the opposition parties, has a motion that I hope we can dispose of without debate. If it goes to debate, we will put it back down to the end of the meeting. I don't want to take away from witness time. So, Ms. Damoff.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to the opposition. I'd like to bring forward a motion that the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 6, 2018 regarding the submission of amendments to Bill C-59, an act respecting national security matters, be rescinded and replaced with the following. That notwithstanding the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, May 3rd, 2016, the date of March 8th, 2018 be designated as the deadline for the submission of amendments to Bill C-59, an act respecting national security matters, by members of the committee as well as by members who are not part of a caucus represented on the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Damoff. Thank you, Ms. Damoff. Any debate? Seeing none, those in favor? Thank you all. Witnesses, thank you for that indulgence. We have for this morning, the first hour this morning, Laura Tribe, Executive Director of Open Media, and from the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, Timothy McSorley. And you each have 10 minutes for your initial presentations. So, Ms. Tribe.
Good morning. My name is Laura Tribe, and I am the Executive Director of Open Media, a community-based organization committed to keeping the internet open, affordable, and surveillance-free. I'm here today with Tim McSorley of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, who were unfortunately not invited by the committee to testify in these proceedings, but whose contributions Open Media believes to be critical for an informed discussion of Bill C-59. Open Media's work on privacy and digital security dates back to Bills C-13 and C-30, but more recently focused on the serious security violations introduced in the previous government's Bill C-51. The open media community's lengthy efforts on these issues include producing Canada's privacy plan, a positive vision for the future of privacy in Canada, crowdsourced from over 125,000 contributors, over 300,000 people speaking up against Bill C-51, 2 national days of action against Bill C-51, organized in partnership with organizations across the country. Over 15,000 citizen comments submitted to the government's national security consultation, and over 6,000 submissions to this committee's written consultation on Bill C-59. Public Safety Canada's report summarizing the national security consultation results showed that Canadians are overwhelmingly in favour of increased protections for personal privacy. More than 4 in 5 responses indicated that their expectation of privacy in the digital world is the same as or higher than in the physical world. So when Bill C-59 was introduced, we were relieved, a sign that change was coming. But the more that the bill was analyzed, the more our worries returned. The changes are less substantive than we had hoped, and invasive new powers were even introduced. Bill C-59 fails to adequately address the information disclosure provisions and terrorist speech offenses brought in by Bill C-51, but also brings in new data collection, cybersecurity, and information sharing powers which further threaten our privacy and security. But today, this committee has the chance to make this right. Over 6,000 Canadians submitted their concerns with Bill C-59 via Open Media's written submission to this consultation. But since then, in the past 2 weeks, we've had almost 10,000 more Canadians sign a new petition concerning the expanded cyber operations powers in the CSE Act of C-59, which I shall read now. To the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. As a concerned Canadian, I am urging you to address the dangerous new powers being proposed for CSE in Bill C-59. Throughout the process of reforming Bill C-51, Canadians have been very clear on the need to scale back the drastic and invasive national security measures in the bill. Public Safety Canada's own What We Learned report, which formed the basis of Bill C-59, confirmed that the majority of stakeholders and experts called for existing measures to be scaled back or repealed completely, and that most participants in the consultations, quote, opted to err on the side of protecting individual rights and freedoms rather than granting additional powers to national security agencies and law enforcement, end quote. The new active and defensive cyber operations powers proposed in Bill C-59 for CSE are directly opposed to the wishes of the majority of Canadians. We asked for privacy, but instead we got an out-of-control spy agency with even more extreme powers than before. Security and privacy experts throughout Canada have expressed in great detail the issues with the proposed bill and the changes that need to be made to protect the privacy and security of Canadians. Experts have warned of the consequences of granting powers like these, powers that would be all the more dangerous given the lack of adequate oversight included in the bill. I would like to point you to the Analysis Communications Security Establishment Act and related provisions in Bill C-59 report produced by the Citizen Lab and the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, CIPIC. The recommendations laid out in this report should be adopted by the SECU committee. In a world and time where digital technologies are being used by so many to threaten our digital safety, we need our government to be helping make the world better, not actively undermining our security. Signed, 9,633 Canadians as of this morning. On behalf of these signatories, plus the over 300,000 concerned with Bill C-51 and the other concerned civil society groups who have been unable to join these proceedings themselves, we respectfully ask that you make things right. We are asking you, our elected representatives, to stand up for our privacy and continue the work of repealing Bill C-51. Digital security is critical to Canada's infrastructure, economy, and future. Please do not compromise this in the name of fear or following other countries' bad practices to lead us in a race to the bottom. We need to be stronger than that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McSorley, with the balance of the 10 minutes.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be able to present today on behalf of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group and our 45 member organizations. I'd like to thank Open Media for inviting us to join them today. I'd like to touch on 3 main points. First, review and oversight. Second, some of the changes to the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service Act. And third, the no-fly list. Regarding oversight and review, the ICLMG greatly welcomes the creation of the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, as well as the Intelligence Commissioner. However, we believe there are important ways both bodies could be strengthened. We hope the committee and government takes this opportunity to ensure both the NSIRA and the Intelligence Commissioner have the powers and resources they need to carry out their important work. Others have given feedback regarding the Intelligence Commissioner, which we largely support, so I will focus on the NSIRA. The ICLMG has long supported an overarching review mechanism as a way to ensure Canadians' rights are not violated and to monitor the effectiveness of Canada's national security activities. C-59 does away with the silos that have restricted the various review agencies' work, which alone is a major improvement. I would highlight 3 issues, though, that we think that the committee should examine regarding strengthening the NSIRA, though. First, to ensure independence, we suggest the NSIRA members be appointed via vote in Parliament and not through Governor and Council. Second, the complaints mechanism in the NSIRA Act should apply not just to the RCMP, CSIS, the CSE, and to security clearances, but be expanded to include at a minimum the national security activities of the CBSA, as well as Global Affairs Canada. Although ideally the complaints mechanism would actually include all federal national security-related activities. Third, CERC has faced important criticism over the lack of transparency in its complaints system. There's in fact an ongoing lawsuit over this issue. We have also raised concerns about CERC's inability to make binding recommendations. The NSIRA Act would transpose these problems onto the new agency. We urge the committee to take this opportunity to improve on the CERC model and ensure we have a strong, effective, overarching review body. Next, regarding changes to the CSIS Act. CSIS's threat reduction powers were introduced with Bill C-51 and heavily criticized at the time. Bill C-59 attempts to solve some of these issues by restricting the powers to a set list of activities. However, we must reiterate in the strongest possible terms our opposition to granting an intelligence agency, which operates in secret, powers akin to those of law enforcement. My time does not allow me to go into all our specific concerns, but at the heart of this is that CSIS's creation was meant to separate intelligence activities from law enforcement, and we continue to have the same concerns from that time today. Even in cases that require a warrant, we believe that a non-adversarial system will not ensure the protection of a target's civil liberties. We do not believe that this is an issue of if the system will violate an individual's rights, but when. We are also concerned by new powers granting CSIS agents immunity for acts or omissions that would otherwise constitute an offense. The Canadian Bar Association, among others, raised serious concerns when these powers were granted to law enforcement officers, calling it antithetical to the rule of law. We believe this even more so when such powers are granted to intelligence agents operating in secret, and that this section should be removed from Bill C-59. And finally, regarding the Secure Air Travel Act and the no-fly list, we support the tremendous efforts by the no-fly list kids and other groups to bring about a redress system. However, we believe the government must go further and address the more fundamental problems with the no-fly list regime. Bill C-59 does not address the due process issues that have been raised since 2007. We cannot condone a system that is used to restrict an individual's travel and to place them on what amounts to a terrorist watch list, but that does not allow them full access to the information against them in order to mount a full and adequate defense. We have also yet to be shown that it improves upon criminal code provisions already in place that can be used to restrict the activities of an individual suspected of planning a crime. While we appreciate potential solutions put forward by others, such as introducing a special advocate system into the appeal process, we do not believe it is sufficient to restore due process. We maintain our fundamental opposition and call for the repeal of the no-fly list regime. For more on our positions, we sent a brief into the committee that I believe was circulated yesterday, so I'd be happy to also take any questions or follow up with that with any members following the meeting. Thank you. And
Thank you, both of you, for your submissions. Ms. Damoff, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming forward today. It's nice to see you again at the committee. We've had a fair bit of testimony, and I've asked witnesses about the way CSE is using global information gathered from the global information infrastructure, and the fact that right now, while they don't spy on Canadians, they can Canadians' information can get wrapped up in whether they're abroad or whether they've been transmitting through this global information infrastructure. So what I'm wondering, would you recommend that we amend C-59 to clarify that a ministerial authorization should be required when CSE acquires information from or through this global information infrastructure where a Canadian is implicated in it?
Thank you. I would say, as a starting point, yes. I think that's critical to have additional authorization required for that type of information collection. I think that there are a lot of concerns about, in particular, the collection of CSE around how that impacts Canadians and how their information is actually collected. You don't show a passport when you browse the internet, and it's really hard to justify who is or isn't a Canadian, and I don't hold that against the intelligence agencies. It's difficult to know that information, but I think a lot of the provisions in the CSE Act are being hedged in, but don't worry, this won't impact Canadians. And that's hard to guarantee. And I think that even further, a lot of the, beyond just the information collection, but a lot of the disruption powers can also impact Canadians. And I think that's where, having that additional authorization is important. But I think using the idea that it won't target Canadians is a little bit misleading, because even if they're not targeted, they will inevitably be affected by the way that the internet is set up and the way that it works.
And I think, just as a comment, I think we freely give information over the internet without giving thought to where it could end up, far more freely than we would if we were filling out a paper form or speaking to someone, right? We just enter that information and then it's out there. Mr. McSorley, what are your thoughts on that?
We would largely agree with what Ms. Tribe just said. I think, as others have pointed out, there's also just questions around the thresholds for those authorizations that we would want to keep in mind. But in general, we have the same concerns that there's no distinguishing what information is traveling over the global information infrastructure, and that there needs to be greater authorizations and oversight of any collection.
Okay. So you'd support an amendment along those lines to the bill then? Okay. We've also heard from organizations about reporting, and I'm just wondering if you think that public and civil society would benefit if the Information Commissioner be mandated to produce an annual public report about the activities of the bodies it oversees, and should CSIS produce an annual report, public report.
We believe that both would be helpful. We believe, as we submitted in our brief, that there's other steps that we think need to be taken to ensure transparency and accountability, but that the fact that the Intelligence Commissioner currently isn't required to submit an annual report is to us a large oversight, and that it should be included, especially because it is currently part of the CSEC Commissioner's, the CSE Commissioner's role. As well as having CSIS produce an annual report, we think would also help to clarify to the public. We saw yesterday CSIS issued a report on research it was doing, and it gives us a chance to debate publicly what kind of research and work that CSIS is carrying out.
Okay.
I would just add, I think one of the things that we've heard from our community is that the reports are really important, that type of transparency is something critical to earn that trust from those commissioners and those in positions of authority overseeing this. But that there's an added need to make sure that the reports are telling the whole story, because a report for the sake of a report doesn't actually instill confidence. So making sure that there are set criteria for what's being included in that, and that there are checks and balances to make sure that it's not just a report for the sake of it. And I think that's a concern that we've heard from our community, and I don't have a specific recommendation for how to ensure that, but I feel it's important to pass along that the report itself won't necessarily gain the trust if it doesn't come with the ensured transparency around it as well.
Well, and I think we do have the new committee of parliamentarians, so that if there was something, I think the idea is for security reasons, you can't put everything into a public report, but hopefully if there was something in there that flagged an issue, that committee of parliamentarians could delve into it more fully, because they do have the ability to do so. So I've got 2 minutes left. Right now, there's no threshold on the retention of personal information within SCISA. And so I'm wondering if you think we should have two parts to this. An amendment to introduce a necessity threshold for the retention of personal information, as well as a destruction obligation for personal information that does not meet the necessity threshold. And if you think that would increase privacy and transparency and privacy.
Yes, please.
We also believe that would improve SCISA. In our brief, we give an outline for why we were opposed to SCISA and have still grave concerns about SCISA. We believe there needs to be more done, as a privacy commissioner brought up in his testimony, regarding threshold for disclosure and receipt of information. And fundamentally, as others have pointed out, we find it's a complex law. Even some of the security officials have said that they're worried it could bring in red tape. We believe that the goal of the law, of the act, is to ensure that there's a legal framework for private information being shared and used for national security purposes. And we would actually urge that the committee and the government reconsider having an act like SCISA that changes the definition of threat to national security and is a very complex law, and instead focus on bringing in something much simpler that would simply set out the threshold for when information can be shared for national security purposes. And that would answer a lot of the questions that have been raised. But that changing SCISA to SCIDA and how it's framed right now won't go far enough.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Baluz.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. Ms. Tribe, in one of the most recent meetings that we've held in public, we had a major expert in international security who said that there were approximately 200,000 Chinese who were working actively on cyber operations. The expert mentioned that China was really a threat to Canada. So knowing that there are real threats, do you still feel it is a reasonable argument to say that the CSE should not have defensive capabilities?
I believe that there are a lot of very real threats to this country, and a lot of them are cyber threats. I think the concern that we are hearing from our community is that this really is a cyber arms race to try and figure out who can build the biggest tools and the most destructive tools the fastest. And so what we are looking for is to increase our security, to build up our protections, to make sure that we are safe from those type of threats without building the vulnerabilities and the tools that can be actively captured and misused by other governments or other malicious actors who are trying to build those tools themselves. And as much as we would love to believe that if Canada builds these tools, we can keep them safe, we have seen that's not the case. I'm sure the NSA felt the same way about a lot of the tools that they have built, and we've seen those misused. We've seen them sit on exploitations that they have used and vulnerabilities that then ended up taking down the UK's National Health Service. And these are the kind of exploitations that we're looking to have Canada proactively prevent, to step in to actually increase our security, to build those protections and tools to keep us safe. And while in the short term it might seem easy, or sorry, I shouldn't say that. I don't think any of this seems easy, but it might seem more simple to try and build the tools to take down the opposition before they get to us. I think that in the end, it creates additional tools that we don't actually want to be out there. It just perpetuates that environment with those malicious actors on the other side that we're fearing, and perpetuates a culture of fear. So I think there are a lot of proactive digital security tools that we can build ourselves to keep us safe. I think that there are a lot of abilities that CSE already has, but I believe that the active cyber operations, particularly the ones geared at deploying tools abroad, pose a large security risk for Canada in the way that they could be exploited.
I find it a little hard to understand where you're going with all this. Canada basically is not a country that wants to be aggressive toward other countries, but we have to protect ourselves. In your written brief, you're saying that we're giving too much power to the CSE, but we have to be prepared to defend our institutions, our systems. You are putting the emphasis on increasing our capability to take offensive operations abroad. Yes, there is an escalation, and we need the means to protect ourselves. You have a video on YouTube, Open Media, and you say that Bill C-59 gives the CSE almost unlimited powers, as you put it, internationally, and that there is even the possibility of having wrong and fake news out that could influence elections and so on, as seems to have happened in the U.S. Now, do you think that the CSE is going to proactively influence other countries and democracy?
The powers are that CSE would use. I know that based on experts' reading of Bill C-59 and the CSE Act, those are the capabilities that are possible within the powers that are being given to CSE. And I think that's the concern, is that, we might not be in a position right now where those are being used, but if we continue to grant those powers, we could be in a place where they are used, and that's our concern.
Mais pensez-vous vraiment que le CSE
Do you really think that the CSE could do that or would want to do that? Why do you think that Canada would want to take that kind of action?
And might and would use those actions if the context arose where they felt it was appropriate. These are really complicated political issues, and I'm not pretending otherwise. And I think that once you have those powers in a very opaque system where it's difficult to build the transparency mechanisms, that it's hard to see how we can put that trust in a system where we consistently see it being misused around the world. And so our concern is not that we immediately think that the current government is about to deploy all of these weapons. It's that we're building the powers without any justification to prove that we need them. And that's our concern.
OK. D'un autre côté,
Okay. Now, you talk about Canada's influence coming from the Government of Canada, but on your website you talk about the need for a call to action and the actions to take and how to do this. So you're asking for the CSE to not have certain powers to take action abroad, but you are calling on people to intervene in the U.S. So it seems to me that your group is promoting the interference that you think that CSE should not have the ability to do?
About our campaigns that we run in the United States. We have a community of supporters of almost 200,000 people within the United States that are active in their own government's activities. And so it is those supporters.
Donc, vous faites des influences quand même. Vous êtes
So you are based in Canada, but you are trying to influence things in the United States. So that's a kind of influence that you're trying to have abroad, but you are asking the Canadian government to put less resources into protecting Canadian security.
Media has the same power or influence as the Canadian government,
Mais
although
il reste que c'est quand même une
I
position.
appreciate that.
Merci, merci.
Thank you.
Please, and possibly you'll want to respond and then after Mr. Dubé's questions. 7 minutes, Mr. Dubé.
Thank you. I think we've confused citizen activism with state surveillance, but anyhow, that's a whole other discussion. I just wanted to ask about this notion that's in the bill about publicly available information. When the Canadian Bar Association was here, there was a discussion about how there isn't really any kind of jurisprudence or legal definition in Canadian law about what publicly available information is. And I think a lot of people have kind of assumed, perhaps wrongly, that that means basically if I Google something right now that's publicly available information. And what was brought up by some witnesses was it could mean information being sold for advertising purposes by social media or search engines like Google. And it could perhaps even go further than that. And I know you at Open Media, you've been very active on some of these sort of, for lack of a better term, digital clauses in trade agreements and things like that, which arguably from this very broad discussion that's happened over publicly available information could potentially be what that means, right? When companies start being able to freely exchange information cross borders in that way. So I'm just wondering, first of all, what you think of it means, publicly available information, and second of all, why that would be concerning in the context of what's being presented here, both with the data sets for CSIS, but also with the capabilities of CSE.
Thank you. I think one of our concerns is that it's unclear what publicly available means. And I think that that's really one of our biggest concerns we would love to have addressed through the amendments in C-59 is really being clear on exactly what these things do or don't mean and aren't left to law enforcement to interpret it themselves. With publicly available information, unless it explicitly says that people are not allowed to purchase commercially available information, to purchase huge data sets, then as far as we're concerned, that's still a possibility and a real concern for us. So we would put forward that that is a problem on the ability to Google everything and start recording all of those data sets. Collecting that mass amount of information in general is of concern. Additionally, proactively purchasing and growing those data sets without any direct targets, without any clear suspicion or motivation is really concerning. As citizens who are trying to live our lives, who are feeling like we are victims or targets or suspicious actors in our own state. And the ability to engage as a citizen is really hard to do without putting a lot of information on the internet right now. Mm-hmm. And so feeling like anything you put out there is now also being proactively collected and stored by your own government is quite terrifying.
We would share those concerns, and I would also like to highlight that publicly available information is both in regards to the CSC as well as CSIS in new data sets collection. And so any concern regarding the CSC's collection of publicly available information, we believe is reflected also in the new powers that will be granted to CSIS. And we share Open Media's concerns that it needs to be further defined. It needs to follow the same authorization process as other information that will be collected, either through data sets for CSIS or through authorizations with the CSC.
Mm-hmm. And the sort of natural follow-up to that is what's collected incidentally, which is also brought up in the legislation, and the counter argument could be made that when they do collect incidental information, it requires authorization to keep, but it feels that the way the thresholds are defined, that it's not sufficient, that it would be relatively easy to justify the collection of incidental information while going after someone else. So what are the concerns about incidental information being collected? And because I think some people, again, I just in sort of the digital world, I think incidental information means something very different than it would have meant with a, for lack of a better term, a more old-fashioned police or national security investigation from 25, 30 years ago, for example?
Yeah, I think the concerns with incidental information is that the non-incidental, the critical information in a lot of cases already feels too broad. And so the ability to keep that incidental information, to first define it and then also retain it, is quite challenging for us as citizens, for our community to really understand what that means to them. How do they know what's incidental? How do we as regular people understand what information is being collected about us, in addition to how hard is it to keep that incidental information? I think that we're hearing a lot of arguments from law enforcement that incidental information is not actually incidental, which is our first concern. And then even when it is, that it could be useful in future. And I think, if you're looking at 25, 30 years ago, that might be a notepad that's stored somewhere in a filing cabinet. I think right now it's these data sets where that information is being cross-referenced against multiple other data sets that can potentially provide a lot of either false positives or misleading information, which actually take away from the very purpose of trying to collect this information in the first place.
Concern would be that the inclusion of incidental information will in fact lead to what others have described as mass surveillance and collecting too much information. There's also been concerns raised as well as metadata not being properly defined and included. And so by combining that with incidental information, which often it could be very important information. Incidental isn't that it's just a minor information about somebody, but something that's collected outside of the scope of what the targeted investigation is. And in that respect, we don't have a clear idea of what that incidental information would be. And so if it is to be retained, it would necessarily have to meet the same authorizations and thresholds for collection and retention and querying, which, as Ms. Tri mentioned, already we have concerns about the level, whether or not those thresholds are at the appropriate level to ensure adequate oversight and adequate sorting of that information.
Just quickly, as my time wraps up here, I'll try and make this as much of a yes or no question as possible, which is always precarious in this line of work. But there's been a notion at the border about how things have changed when it comes to cell phones. There's the suitcase rule, or however it's referred to, where you kind of have this expectation of sacrificing some privacy when you cross the border, whereas now with the ability being explored more and more to look at cell phones, that's different. Do you feel with legislation like this that the same kind of principle applies, that in a traditional investigation there would have been an expectation to hand things over, whereas now cell phones have so much information on it that the expectation has shifted in terms of what people are giving up to investigators?
Yes. And, we are actively campaigning on both sides of the border around increasing border privacy for cell phones because there is so much information that is available there. And I think, yes, sorry, that's it.
It's okay.
Okay. Monsieur Picard, 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. You mentioned that we have laws and regulation that mention that we don't spy on Canadians, and we have the CST commissioner who came in before us confirming that there's no spying on Canadians. And even that, you mentioned at the beginning of your speech that that spying on Canadians is not a guarantee, and we cannot trust the simple fact that although it's written somewhere that we are not sure that the CST will or will not spy on Canadians. What does it take then to make sure that we can assure that?
I think that one of the things that is important to address is that they cannot be sure, and that there will be some spying on Canadians. So when that information is identified as being as Canadians' data or information being collected, it's immediately treated otherwise, but also proactively putting in those protections to ensure that Canadians are not included. And I think that in some cases, some of the provisions that are being put forward in the CSE Act will inevitably target Canadians. And I think that's one of the things that we are raising concerns around. I think there's a number of recommendations in the Citizen Lab CIPIC report that would also help address that. But I think that the biggest thing is to recognize that it doesn't just work that way. And we have to put provisions in place for trying to proactively identify Canadian information, and then also making sure that it's treated as such once it is identified, and recognizing that it might also just be that Canadians are going to be caught up in this. So let's not build systems that we don't want Canadians to be a part of.
When you talk to a stranger, do you ask whether the stranger can be under surveillance by another country so you don't get caught in a maybe monitored call?
Personally ask, people.
If you talk to a stranger, how do you make sure that you will not be caught in a monitored call because this person might be a target?
It's true. We don't know if in our communications where it could be targeted or surveilled, and that's why we believe that we need the strongest possible authorizations and restrictions on how the surveillance tools are used, both in Canada and part of what we do at the ICLMG is we argue that Canada also has an obligation to kind of set a standard and to work internationally to ensure that there's a standard for what other countries do as well on an international level. And we know that's difficult to achieve. We're not, dreaming that every country is going to be friendly and not spy. But we believe that Canada states that it plays a proactive role in protecting civil liberties and human rights on the international level, and that we need to set those policies domestically in order to set an example internationally.
The work both of your organization is doing, making sure that our private life is well protected, our rights are well protected, is needed, and we salute that. I had the privilege of leading more than a dozen of consultation on C-59. The first year was here, and people were very loud on both sides of the fence. Those who want a better protection and those who they accept the fact that we need to maybe compromise, if the word works, compromise part of our privacy in order to make sure that we are safe. And I'm sure that you did a lot of research on here and there to make sure that you get the most precise comment and value-added comment supporting both sides of the fence. What is the nature of the comments you receive from those who accept reducing their privacy in order to be more secure?
The majority of comments that we received, in fact, I would say almost the entirety of comments that the open media community submitted, were not asking for us to compromise our privacy. I think that we saw in the consultation results that over 80% of submissions actually asked to increase our individual privacy, feeling that we've already overstepped those boundaries of individual privacy in the name of protecting national security, and that it isn't actually a balance. And I think that's really the biggest problem that we keep running into, is acting as though we have to sacrifice all of our personal information in order to be safe, when in actual effect, we haven't seen any evidence that the mass surveillance and mass collection of data has helped prevent any national security incidents. And we also haven't seen any evidence that, excuse me, that information is lacking in future. We haven't seen that it's providing the insights that we need. And all we've ended up seeing is that Canadians are scared. They're scared of the information their government is collecting about them. They're scared about how it could be misused in future. Maybe not by this government, but the government after that or the one after that. We've seen a lot of fear after the change in government in the United States and the way that the information is being misused about what happens when that information gets into different hands. And that's only when it stays within the government. And if that information gets into the hands of someone outside of the government, if we hope never happens, our intelligence agencies are actually compromised themselves. We have and are collecting the information on our own citizens that hand it over to any other government. That's terrifying. And so I think what we're really hearing from our community is, prove to us that you need it. Prove to us that it helps.
You mentioned that with the technology, and I'm following Mr. Paul's question, the technology and other countries may increase that threat in Canada, and therefore you are looking for, and I'll quote you, tools to take down. So you are open to the possibility of taking measures to make sure that we reduce the aggression or the attack before it happens, and then we have to act after the fact. So what are the justification behind your position to increase those measures to be offensive, which seems to be the same justification you do not allow CSIS or CST to act for the same reasons?
I'm not clear on exactly which contribution of ours you're quoting, but I would say that our concern is that we don't have strong enough protections internally to prevent ourselves from cyber attack, making Canadians and Canada's databases vulnerable, in addition to the fact that we do not believe that we should be proactively creating devices, tools, and technologies to go on the cyber offensive, particularly without the checks and balances that we're asking to be put in place.
It appears that we've had a massive case of inter-party cooperation break out here. Mr. Dubé, 5 minutes.
Thank you. We don't want to start trends here, or rumors of any kind. I just wanted to go back to the issue of data sets. I think even for parliamentarians, some confusion as to what that means. And I think the Privacy Commissioner made an important and interesting point when he mentioned that there's always this, you always have to consider the future definition of what it will be as technology evolves, but also how it's being defined currently, and that I'm just wondering what you think of the definition and whether that or not that's appropriate both for now, but also how things will change in the future.
Sorry, just to clarify, do you mean a specific kind of data set for CSIS or just the idea of data sets in general?
In general, and also just how it's defined in the bill.
Right. So our concern is that without allowing for the definition of what data sets are on a yearly basis, it is concerning. We believe there should be more clarity as to what those data sets could and should be. As well, we're worried, as others have pointed out, that throughout the process of collecting those data sets, that there's a changing threshold in terms of what can be collected, what can be retained, and then what can be queried. And that rather than allowing for so much information to be collected at the beginning and then narrowing it as we go, that there should be strong requirements from the very beginning in terms of what information can go into those data sets. And of course, as we've already mentioned, the fact that publicly available information could form a kind of data set is a concern. There's also concern that at the very tail end of CSIS data sets, that information collected for Canadian data sets can be accessed on a lower threshold for foreign surveillance purposes. It's concerning, and that information collected by CSIS for foreign purposes can be collected, albeit at a higher threshold, from those data sets for domestic intelligence purposes. And so we believe that to fix that problem, that we need stronger authorization and stronger thresholds from the beginning. And as we've mentioned, an increase in the transparency and the powers of the Intelligence Commissioner to verify those data sets and those authorizations.
I would just add that I think the shifting definition of data sets, the different interpretations of data sets, comes back to the bigger question, which we keep revisiting, which is if it's difficult for the government to understand it, it's really difficult for citizens to understand what it means. And I think that ultimately, to give this much power to governments to collect this information, to our law enforcement agencies to gather and use this information, requires a large level of public trust. And when the definitions keep changing and when it seems very vague or hard for parliamentary committees to understand and nail down, it's really hard for our community to understand what it means and what's included in it. And so any clarity that can be provided on that would be much appreciated.
Great, thank you. I just want to shift gears a bit and go to the position of the Intelligence Commissioner. And it perhaps seems like a nitpicking thing, but I think it's important, this notion that it's essentially it's a part-time position. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, if you think it should be full-time, especially considering that should this bill be adopted, it's essentially the only form of real-time oversight versus everything else in this country that's review-based after the fact.
We believe it should be a full-time position, and as others have suggested, that perhaps a pool could be expanded from being a retired judge to looking at the current kind of judicial pool. But definitely for the amount of work that's expected from the Intelligence Commissioner, we believe it needs to be a full-time position.
We would agree.
Great. Thank you very much. And well, just with the last minute that's left, when it comes to information sharing, how concerned are we about the essentially what we're just seeing as just cosmetic changes in this bill from what was brought in by the former Bill C-51? I know you mentioned it in your comments, and I don't really have time to get into some of the details I was going to ask about, but just perhaps we could reiterate those concerns with the 30 seconds that are probably left.
30 seconds, okay. I think we have definitely have big concerns about the Information Sharing Act not really being revised or overhauled in the way that we had hoped for C-51. I think one of the big changes that we would look for is actually just limiting the information requested to those who request it, and not allowing it to be continued shared between departments after the fact, and also limiting who can access information within other government agencies.
Thank you, Mr. Dubé. Ms. DeBruzen, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I actually want to pick up on where you left off about where you see it going with information sharing, because in your opening statement, Mr. McSorley, you were talking about how you would like to see a simplified version. And when I'm looking at this, I'm mindful also of the Air India recommendations that pointed out that there were very strong problems with the system of not sharing information, and that led to 280 Canadians losing their lives. So mindful of that as a background, and that mindful of some of the concerns that you raise as well. What would you see as a simplified version? If you had us doing the rewrite, what would you want to see?
It's difficult to say precisely legally what it should say, but what I would say is that...
Unfortunately, that's where we're at now,
I
so
realize that, yeah. But we believe that it should be based on principles of information, what's defined under the Privacy Act, and so that information that is private for Canadians, if it is to be shared for national security purposes, that meets the threshold of necessity. And that there's clear, as is laid out already in SCEDA, that there's clear record keeping as to what information is being shared, but that there needs to be a necessity threshold.
So I want to stop you there. So you said, but that is in the SCEDA then?
The record keeping, and we believe that should be continued because it's obviously important to have records, but that it should be at a necessity level. That to us, we're baffled that the expanded definition of a threat to national security is continued with SCEDA. We believe that should be removed, and that we follow what's in the CSIS Act in terms of the definition of a threat to Canada's national security. And off the top of my head, I think that those would answer a lot of our concerns. But in general, what we see right now with the question of the different levels of threshold, the expanded definition of what constitutes a threat that undermines Canada's national security, raises serious concerns for us. And I don't believe rolling that back would undermine what came out of the Air India inquiry, because clearly we need to be sharing the information between government agencies.
So I'm just looking at the sections, because we are at this point looking at the legal wording in this bill. You're talking about activity that undermines the security of Canada. One section that has received some comment from, I believe it's Professor Workin Forse, is the conduct that takes place in Canada and that undermines the security of another state. Mm-hmm. Is that where your concern is?
That's one of the concerns. We're also concerned regarding the inclusion of critical infrastructure as being a threat to Canada's national security. We're also concerned, and CCLA has raised this, that the changed wording around trying to carve out a political expression and activism, adding in the clause that unless it's carried out in conjunction with one of those issues, actually it causes a larger problem than what we see under the current in SCEDA.
Do you mind? So I want to stop, because I wanted to ask you about the critical infrastructure, and I only have about a minute and 20 seconds left. So you're talking about it's at the request. It has to be, there has to be a consent on the critical infrastructure piece in this legislation. So, for example, if you had hospitals or something, and I believe we had some evidence that is in fact one big area to be worried or to be concerned about. What's your concern about that, about the critical infrastructure?
Right. So our concern isn't regarding the access of CSE's powers to be able to help support and improve the critical infrastructure. It's regarding the information sharing that could be triggered by a threat to critical infrastructure. And so in combination, for example, we see opposition right now to pipelines being built across Canada. We've seen in the past Indigenous actions where a train line is blocked or a protest, causes disruptions. We're concerned that the current way that SCEDA and eventually SCEDA will be worded would continue to pose a threat to legitimate dissent and protest actions in Canada by including critical infrastructure as it's currently defined.
I think I'm out of time.
Thank you very much. Ms. DeBruzen, Mr. Dubé, 5 minutes, please.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the the information sharing issue again, just because there was a report in La Presse a few weeks ago where they talked about this RCMP operation where they essentially collect information from the DEA on Canadians, and then that circumvents the warrant system and all the other legal and accountability measures that would be in place normally for that type of thing. So I'm just wondering, in this context, where departments are exchanging information, so if you're working with Five Eyes allies, let's say, and then the RCMP is taking that kind of action, and then that information can then be shared between departments, I just want to elaborate on this notion beyond even the legislation, this ecosystem almost that exists, where I think people are underestimating that it seems on the surface to make sense that, hey, Canadian Department A should share information with Canadian Department B, but just how it goes beyond that, and just maybe hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. One of our concerns beyond just intergovernmental, inter-Canadian department information sharing really is, how does that feed into the Five Eyes network and all of the different agencies within that? And I think the DEA providing information to the RCMP is a great example of that. I think one of the big concerns we have is we actually don't know and don't have information that says how many information sharing agreements Canada has. We don't know who they're with. We don't know what all of them are. So we don't know, when we give our information over to the Canadian government or it's being collected, where it could end up. And conversely, we don't know, when we take part in other countries, how that information could end up back in Canada. And I think one of the concerns that we really have, and that our community continues to express, is feeling like no matter what information it is, eventually anyone can get it within the Five Eyes agencies, within any of their related countries' departments, that once it's in a data set, it is in everyone's. And there's a lot of concerns around that when it comes to accurate record keeping, to how that data can be misused, which I think Mahararar is a great example of that, and really been used to demonstrate some of the more extreme consequences of that. But it also comes to simple things like no-fly lists. It comes to all kinds of things where simple mistaken identities from a different agency outside of the Canadian government can give us a total spiral of how our information is handled domestically, and vice versa. And so I think that's where really outlining who can share what information with who and what those information sharing agreements are would go a really long way.
Ms. Tribe summarized our concerns really well. I think I just add one of the recommendations that we're making is that, especially for the CSC Act and for CSIS, that there be proactive rules put in place around the disclosure of foreign intelligence sharing, as well as around SKISA and SKIDA, that we have clear definitions around what foreign information sharing is taking place and how it can take place. And keeping in mind that, as Ms. Tribe said, we don't know where that information could eventually end up.
And something that's come up a few times, and the minister has evoked interest in this, but nothing has really come of it yet. Do you both believe that there should be an oversight and complaints mechanism specifically for CBSA, which is arguably, or not arguably, which is currently the only body dealing with national security that currently doesn't have that kind of thing in place?
Yes, but I think Tim might have more to say on that one.
Sure.
We believe there needs to be, on its own, an independent review body for CBSA. As I mentioned, we believe that CBSA should be added into the complaints mechanism for the NSIRA regarding its regarding its national security activities, but that there's so much that CBSA does that isn't specific to national security, and the fact that it is an evolving and changing definition, that there needs to be a review agency for CBSA on its own.
So just on that, with the minute I have left, because there's a sense that national security, arguably CBSA, everything they do could be considered national security because it involves the flow at the border. So is there any concern that definition is not tight enough, even for the work that currently existing bodies like SECU do, for example, when they have to follow the breadcrumbs leading to CBSA?
Well, I think that because national security can be viewed large, in fact, by including CBSA in the complaints mechanism, it would actually open up NSIRA to really be able to dig into what's happening at the CBSA. So in this case, it actually, they'll be able to go further. But at the same time, we need to clarity on what constitutes national security, so that on the other side, it can't in private be shrunk down to saying that national security is only when somebody is flagged on a no-fly list or something like that, and that everything else, for example, refugees and issues like that, aren't considered.
Okay, thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Dubé. Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Dubé. We have now a colleague for 5 minutes.
Almost 20 years ago, Steve Anderson, the founder of Open Media, was my roommate at Western University. So please say hello. In any case, I want to actually begin with Ms. Tribe, if I could, and follow up on some of the questioning that we've heard about with respect to CSE. This committee has heard a great deal of testimony on the threats to Canada's critical infrastructure, our hydroelectrical system, nuclear energy, the banking system, and in particular healthcare, the health information, I should say, that exists and could be under threat. I take what you say about CSE seriously, although I disagree, because I think we have to have an offensive capability that can protect that critical infrastructure. But from your perspective, I'd like to understand how you would, and it's not a loaded question, I'm actually sincere in asking it, how would you advise this Canadian government, any Canadian government, to guard itself from what are very real threats in the cyber network that exist?
Our biggest
cybersphere,
cybersphere, the cyber arena. I think the biggest concerns that we have are that there aren't checks and balances in place in the way that the CSE Act is currently worded. I mean, there's 90 pages worth of report and recommendations that have been put forward on it specifically by Citizen Lab and CIPIC, which I think get at a lot of the details. But fundamentally, what our concerns are is that the scope is too broad and it lets CSE do too much without the accountability and the checks and balances to make sure that it's only being used if someone is targeting something like our energy infrastructure.
Because my time is limited, I want to read a quotation from you. It comes from James Lewis, the director of the Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who says that the most effective way to provide sustainable and long-term protection against cyber attacks is through offensive capabilities and the destruction of opponent networks and systems. If we continue with an orientation that is strictly defensive, it's the equivalent of a static defense defending fixed positions rather than maneuvering and conceding initiative to opponents. So the nature of national security is changing on a constant basis. Our Five Eyes allies have the ability to carry out an offensive cyber approach. And I'm not simply speaking about the United States. New Zealand, Australia, middle powers like Canada have this ability already. In fact, we've heard at this committee that we are behind those countries. So what would you say to someone like Professor Lewis here, who is saying that if countries like Canada choose not to act, then we're always going to be on the defensive and we can't actually preempt attacks again to critical infrastructure that's so important for the safety and security of this country?
I think
and its citizens.
there are two responses to that. The first is that is a very proactive military solution or militaristic style solution, which is fundamentally just not what we're hearing from our community is the approach they're looking at. And it might look and feel different because it's being done online, but it's the exact same approach as feeling like we need to get them before they get us, which is just a difference of opinion, and we might just have to agree to disagree in that belief. I think that the idea that we need to keep up with everyone else is really what's gotten us here in the first place. And I think that's the challenge that we're facing. And I don't think that just because other countries are doing it means that we have to. And I think that CSE already has an immense number of powers around hacking and disruption as it is that we are looking to ensure have transparency and oversight around.
So if your banking data was to suddenly be hacked and in fact disappear, if the vital health information that exists that doctors need to access was to disappear, if all our electrical system was to suddenly collapse, what would you say to that? Because if we're simply on the defensive and not acting against threats, in an offensive way, I think the security of the country really would be compromised. Like, do you see that point?
Absolutely, I see that point, and I think that we are focusing so much on trying to get them before they get us. We're failing to recognize where we're weak, where we're vulnerable, and also ignoring some of the powers that we already have. And I think that, if our health information is to suddenly disappear, of course that's of concern. I don't think that the ability, I think that there are a number of abilities that CSE might like, or we might like them to have, that potentially are even proposed within the CSE Act, but it doesn't come with the limitations that we need to ensure that it's only being used for things like our health information. I think that the scope is too broad. I think that the clarifications are not there to provide the trust that Canadians need. We weren't consulted on it. We were never asked in the consultation what we thought about giving CSE new powers, and I think that's where our community's concern comes from.
Final question: where does terrorism?
Merci,
Oh,
monsieur.
okay.
Merci, Peter.
We'll talk.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. Thank you. We're going to adjourn for just a few minutes until our next witnesses are in place. Thank you.
We're ready to go, to start. S'il vous plaît. Conservateur comme président, là. Conservateur comme président, là. Excuse, M. Motz. Sean. Donc, bonjour.
So, good morning. Mr. Nesbitt, can you hear the translation? Can you hear the English? Yes. So, I'd like to say hello to everyone and welcome to Malcolm Mostyn and David Matus from B'nai B'rith, and by video conference, Michael Nesbitt, Professor of Law, University of Calgary. We will begin with questions? No, sorry. I'm just acting here as chair, so we will start with Mr. Nesbitt, please. Your presentation.
Let me start by thanking you all for this wonderful opportunity and for undertaking this crucial task of reviewing Bill C-59. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be here today and to sit with you. I've been asked to focus my attention today on Part 3 of Bill C-59, which is the proposed CSE Act, and so that is what I intend to do. In general, there's no question to me that updating the antiquated authorities governing the CSE and putting the establishment on solid statutory footing is vitally important. As a result, I'm strongly in favor of the initiative to craft this CSE Act. Indeed, it's obvious to me that the result of this endeavor is a carefully crafted piece of legislation that tries hard to balance the operational needs of CSE to protect Canada's national security interests with Canada's commitment to democracy and the rule of law. But obviously, given its size and complexity, there will also be much work to do. That simply goes with the territory. In this regard, I've had the distinct benefit of reading the briefs and testimonies of the witnesses that have already presented before this committee. While each guest has offered thoughtful commentary that I encourage you to strongly consider, my overarching sense is that none of us will foresee the legal or operational challenges to come, or at least all of them. This is the reality of dealing with such a large, important, complex, and highly technical bill. Thus, more than anything else, it will be vitally important that the current review of the CSE Act is thorough and rigorous, and that such rigorous review and oversight continues, particularly in the early days and early years. This is not an act that should look precisely as it does now by the summer, or when it is first reviewed years after coming into force. It will have to be updated to keep pace with technology and operational and legal developments. The best bet then, to my mind, is to focus on robust review and oversight, such that the issues that do arise in the coming days and years come to the attention of Parliament and to the public and to the CSE itself, and that there is an opportunity to make the necessary corrections when the time comes. Neither the law nor Canada's security is well served if the CSE's legal and or operational fault lines are kept in the shadows, and it is my sense that the CSE would agree with that sentiment. For this reason, I would start by encouraging you to adopt Professor Kent Roach's recommendation that the review contemplated in Part 9 of the Act take place sooner rather than later. The same goes for the CSE Commissioner's recommendation with regard to the need for the Intelligence Commissioner to produce an annual report on his or her authorizations to be tabled in both houses yearly. And then there is the need to ensure that any activities that implicate a reasonable expectation of privacy, and thus implicate Section 8 of the Charter by necessity, are properly overseen by the Intelligence Commissioner. Here, I have three things in mind. First, the CSE Commissioner has already recommended that Section 37(3) of the CSE Act be amended to require the IC approval of ministerial authorizations to extend foreign intelligence operations. Indeed, if the original operation requires IC approval, so too should any follow-up. Arguably, the IC will have more information on which to base the reasonable decision at this reauthorization stage. And more to the point, it is at this later stage that we will really see whether and how much incidental collection of Canadian content is forming a part of the foreign intelligence collection. This brings me fairly neatly to my second point, I encourage you to focus your legal review of the proposed CSE Act on those sections that implicate the collection of incidental information, not, as we commonly say, directed at Canadians. We have seen in the past, including recently in both the US and Canada, that the lack of oversight over just this sort of incidentally collected information can cause great legal and political controversy that I don't believe anyone is looking for. In the context of the proposed CSE Act, I would then here encourage you to adopt Professor Craig Forsyth's call to amend subsections 23.3 dealing with the collection of foreign intelligence and 23.4 dealing with cybersecurity, such that CSE is made to seek ministerial authorization and thus IC oversight where its activities will contravene an act of Parliament, as it currently states, or involve the acquisition of information in which a Canadian or person in Canada has a reasonable expectation of privacy. Our charter demands oversight where there is a reasonable expectation of privacy. It is thus very hard to see how without ministerial authorization and IC oversight, the bulk collection of information that implicates the reasonable expectation of privacy, which under the current wording could be permitted, would hold up in any court of law in Canada. Third and finally, I believe you have heard testimony that has expressed concern about the collection of publicly available data without the oversight of the IC. I'm happy to provide more detail here during the question period. For now, I will simply say that one can certainly be sympathetic to the carve-out for publicly available data. If the public can access it, surely there is no need for the CSE to get approval to do the same, or so the theory might go. But not all publicly available information is the same, and bulk publicly accessible information in the hands of the state is a very different thing indeed from that information in the hands of an individual like you or I. For example, unlawfully obtained information, hacked passwords, for example, can become public, but nevertheless will also be thought of as private information, at least in the eyes of those who hold those passwords. Moreover, discrete pieces of public information may seem harmless on their own, but when harnessed together by the state to produce big data analytics, which can also be publicly purchased and then collected as one quote-unquote piece of information, the amalgam of public information can offer very private insights into the lives of individuals. Of course, all of this adds to the thinking, which is already present with respect to some publicly available information, that in the right context, public information can itself implicate a reasonable expectation of privacy and thus implicate Section 7 of the Charter once again. Put another way, just because it was accessed publicly does not mean it doesn't implicate the privacy protections of our Charter. This will, of course, have ripple effects for how that information can be used and shared. With IC oversight, for example, such private, quote-unquote, public information might be shared with the RCMP for prosecutorial purposes. Without IC oversight, information collected in violation of the Charter will not likely be able to be used in support of such prosecutions. In short, unless CSC's collection of public information is brought under the purview of the IC, there is real reason to fear that we have both a security and a liberty concern here. Thank you very much for your time.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Nesbitt. Now 10 minutes for Mr. Mostyn.
We'll be sharing my time with Mr. Matus. We thank the committee for inviting us to appear. I will provide some introductory remarks. My colleague David Matus, our senior legal counsel, will elaborate on some of our key points to the proposed legislation. B'nai B'rith Canada is this country's oldest national Jewish organization, founded in 1875, with a long history of defending the human rights of Canadian Jewry and others across the country. We advocate for the interests of the grassroots Jewish community in Canada and for their rights such as freedom of conscience and religion. B'nai B'rith Canada testified before this committee in 2015 and most recently in February 2017 on what was then Bill C-51. Our testimony today will develop the same points we have previously expressed, and we will focus on specific areas that touch on our work, particularly Part 7. Our latest audit of anti-Semitic incidents in Canada contains a key truth. Jews are consistently targeted by hate and bias-related crimes in Canada at a rate higher than any other identifiable group. Statistics Canada recently released its report on 2016 police-reported hate crimes, and once again Jews were targeted more than any other group in the country. But police-reported hate crimes are only the tip of the iceberg. We require better tools, data, and analysis to gain greater insights into all hate crimes and do a better job of countering them. Bill C-59 includes proposals to change the criminal code aimed at improving efficiency and effectiveness to the terrorist entity listing regime. We endorse those proposals, providing for a staggered ministerial review of listed entities and granting the minister the authority to amend the names, including aliases, of listed entities. In the past, B'nai B'rith has been supportive of measures to empower security officials to criminalize advocacy and promotion of terrorism and seize terrorist propaganda. We supported these measures to deny those intent on inspiring, radicalizing, or recruiting Canadians to commit acts of terror and who exploit the legal leeway to be clever but dangerous with their words. Bill C-59 seeks to change the law's articulation of this offense from advocacy and promotion to counseling, the commission of a terrorism offense. This is a weakening of the law, which we believe is unhelpful. We have noted the assurances provided by the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, but we are still uncertain that such a change, which in our view weakens the law, is needed. The change of advocacy and promotion to counseling also impacts on the definition of terrorism propaganda. C-59 would remove advocacy and promotion of terrorism offenses in general from the definition. This is also a weakening of the law. We accept that the right to freedom of expression is an important consideration, but the right of potential victims to be free from terrorism and the threat of terrorism must be a greater priority. The importance of a clear articulation of the penalties for advocacy and promotion of terrorism should include the glorification of terrorism, something which should be of concern to all of us. These are specific points I want to raise. There are others which, while not specifically part of the proposed amendments to Bill C-59, are intimately associated and which are of interest and concern to B'nai B'rith Canada. And there are further points here, but some I'd like to highlight are that the continuing manifestation of anti-Semitism, hate crimes, and hate speech in Canada affect not only the Jewish community. B'nai B'rith Canada sees these worrying trends as national security issues. Organizations such as ours, working with law enforcement agencies at the federal, provincial, and municipal level, must address these issues collaboratively. The government's framework to counter youth radicalization is also extremely important. We endorse the work of the Canada Centre for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence. Look forward to stronger dialogue with them. How can we collaborate in the more effective monitoring of groups engaged in hate speech or incitement directed at children, including those using coded messages that are nonetheless threatening, even where these might fall short of actual crimes? This is very much the focus of countering radicalization at an early stage, where civil society can have better dialogue with law enforcement. How can we ensure that government agencies shun questionable organizations and groups, particularly those which receive government grants and nonetheless are operating in ways inimical to the fundamental rights and freedoms of Canadian society? We would welcome a channel of dialogue for this purpose. And lastly, how can we better engage in dialogue with the Canadian Revenue Agency to ensure diligent follow-up to complaints regarding organizations engaged in or supporting those expressing hate speech at odds with their charitable status? There are other points, as I mentioned, in our paper, and I'm sure we can answer that in questions, and I'd now like to cede the floor to my colleague, David Matus.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for allowing us to be here. I want to restrict my remarks to one particular component of the bill, the proposal to remove from the criminal code the offense of advocating or promoting a terrorist offense, and to replace it with the offense of counseling a terrorist offense. We are sympathetic to the express government motivation which led to the introduction of this change. We nonetheless believe that the proposal is problematic. Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale expressed concern that there were no prosecutions under the existing law. He introduced the change, so he said, in order to introduce a more familiar offense for which prosecution would be easier. We too, of course, are concerned with the absence of prosecutions under the existing law. However, it is far from obvious that changing the offenses of advocacy and promotion to the offense of counseling will resolve this problem. For one, we note that, as you've already seen in the submission of the International Civil Liberty Monitoring Group, there is the view that the offense of counseling is superfluous now because that offense already exists in the criminal code. Well, if that submission is right and the offense is already there, then shifting the offense of advocacy and promotion of terrorism to counseling of terrorism will do nothing to solve the problem of inactive prosecution. Saying the same thing twice does nothing to spur prosecutions. If incitement to commit a terrorist offense was not prosecuted under the present counseling law, there's no reason why it would be prosecuted under a repetition of that law. The alternative, of course, is that the proposed counseling offense does add something new, that it is not just a reenactment of the already existing offense. However, if that is the case, then the advantage of familiarity with an existing standard that the minister touted does not exist. If this counseling offense is different from already existing counseling offenses, then the teething problems the existing advocacy and promotion law have arguably suffered, this new law will also suffer. The rationale of the minister for the need to enact a familiar offense to make the law work is further undermined by the fact that advocacy and promotion are not new and different offenses. The offense of advocacy exists for both genocide and sexual activity with a person under age of 18. The offense of promotion exists both for genocide and hatred. In my written materials, I go through a number of cases in the Supreme Court of Canada that look at and define and circumscribe these offenses of advocacy and promotion. So we already have plenty of legal guidance about the meaning of the concepts of advocacy and promotion. The notion that prosecutors have stayed their hands because they are uncertain about the meaning of the current law or worried about its overbreadth is not supported by an examination of the criminal code and the jurisprudence. The minister has identified a real problem, a failure of prosecutions under the existing law despite the multiplicity of apparent violations. The solution he proposes, we suggest, does not directly address the problem. The solution, we suggest, lies elsewhere. The prosecution of incitement to terrorism within Crown investigation and prosecution offices needs to be given a higher priority. There needs to be more resources, more expertise, more training. There needs to be more international cooperation, more experience sharing, more learning from others, including Israel, who have had to grapple with this problem. We would encourage Canada to sign and ratify the Council of Europe Convention on the Prevention of Terrorism, which incorporates a specific obligation to prohibit public provocation of terrorism. Ratifying the treaty would not only allow for closer collaboration between Canada and other terror-combating states, it would also make directly relevant to Canada the jurisprudence in other countries and the European Court of Human Rights, which interpret the relevant treaty provisions. The government could publish advisory guidelines on its understanding of the meaning of the advocacy of or promotion of terrorism. The guidelines would not bind prosecutors, but could help dispel uncertainty. One suggested, already indicated by my colleague Michael Mostyn, is that the guidelines should state that glorification of terrorism should be included in advocacy or promotion of terrorism. We welcome the fact that the government and the committee are giving the combat against incitement to terrorism the attention it deserves. It remains nonetheless for us all to choose the best course to follow in combating this scourge. Thank you.
Merci, messieurs. Donc, on va commencer.
Thank you. To our witnesses, we'll start with our questions. Mr. Fredrikakis.
All witnesses. I want to begin with B'nai B'rith, if I could. You mentioned in your comments at the outset the recent StatsCan report that has been compiled on hate crimes. We've heard a number of witnesses speak about specifically national security, conceptions of national security, how they define threats to this country. The conclusion that I've come to is that this is a matter of perspective. Daesh is certainly a clear threat to Canada and to other democracies, but it is not the only threat. From your perspective, Mr. Mostyn, could you speak to the threat of far-right groups who take an anti-Semitic view and what that means for the Jewish community in Canada? Because I think that matter of perspective can get us a long way to understanding what exactly is the nature of the threats that are confronting Canada, because I don't think we can pick one or two or even three. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the question, and I think it's a very important question, and it points to how interrelated some of these hatreds are, and actually towards a pathway towards radicalization and terrorism in certain cases. As you mentioned, there is something of a resurgence within the extreme right. the neo-Nazi movement. Just recently, there's a Canadian, Monica Schaefer, who's sitting in jail in Germany for the promotion of Holocaust denial. She's a dual citizen and a former political candidate for a political party here in Canada. The one thing that seems to connect the extreme right anti-Semitism, extreme left anti-Semitism, unfortunately seems to be the hatred of Jews. And they're very explicit about that hatred. And it's interesting because when you're talking about the pathway an individual might go down, whether it's for a criminal code offense of hate speech or further down towards actually engaging in an act of terrorism, promotion and incitement to terror begins with the vilification of a target group, and it starts in broad and general terms and then incessantly dehumanizes that target group until eventually that pathway has gone so that an individual has accepted the ideology and is willing to act out on that ideology. That we know is the pathway down to radicalization. That's why B'nai B'rith has been speaking out so strongly about hate speech, because we don't want it to get to that pathway where individuals, and particularly those that are most vulnerable, like youth, get those messages, dehumanize certain groups, and then act upon that. And once again, that's why we're focusing on the promotion of terrorism here, because this is something that we don't want to see in our country, because it is a real threat, and unfortunately, in the world today, it's a growing threat.
Of course, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one comment I would make is the Jewish community, unfortunately, of course, has been the target of terrorist offenses from a variety of different groups, but it also historically has been a victim of violation of the right to freedom of expression through religious intolerance. And as a result, we have a lived experience of the violation of both of these rights, the loss of which we feel keenly, and have had to sort of grapple in our own minds and through our own experience the need to balance these rights off against each other, which leads us to come to the conclusions we do.
Thank you very much to both of you for that. I want to pick up on something that was mentioned towards the end of your comments, and that's the critique of the change of the from C-51, the speech crime provision, and changing that to a counseling offense. It's interesting because one of the criticisms of C-51 was under that speech crime provision, as it was written, it was conceivable, and I'll give you an example, for a journalist, a Canadian journalist, to be convicted under C-51 for writing in favor of some of the actions that were taken by anti-apartheid activists who were carrying out actions on infrastructure against the racist South African state in the 1980s, if C-51 obviously had been in place during that time. So with the counseling offense, this is much more common in existing criminal law. It still would allow for individuals who are involved in encouraging terrorism to face legal consequences. So I wonder from this perspective, if you could comment. I mean, do you see that point about the dangers of C-51 and how that might impact upon freedom of expression?
Well, I would say any law has to be interpreted purposefully and with the limitations imposed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And as I said, advocacy and promotion have both been canvassed extensively by all courts, including the Supreme Court of Canada, in a variety of cases. The Keekstra, Mugesera, Sharp have been dealing with these concepts at the Supreme Court of Canada, and B'nai B'rith intervened in a couple of them, and I myself intervened in a Sharp case for another NGO. I mean, it's possible to think about any law that can be abused or misinterpreted or misapplied, but what we're looking at is what the law is intended to get at, and there are some real problems there. One of the examples that the court gave in one of these cases is in one of Shakespeare's plays. There's this statement: "Let's kill all the lawyers." which, I mean,
Let's
we're
not.
both lawyers, and we obviously don't like that.
I'm not even a lawyer, but I know some of my colleagues are. So Julia is.
But we concede it doesn't fall within these laws, I think in looking at the law, we shouldn't look at it in such a way that it makes the law look absurd, because that can undercut almost any law.
Thank you, Mr. Mattis. If I could go to Professor Nesbitt. I know, Professor Nesbitt, you have been critical of CSIS having disruption powers. You have expressed concern on that front. Should CSIS have any disruptive powers? Should its officials not have an opportunity to get in the way of potential attacks before they strike Canada and compromise our security? I'm just trying to understand where you see an intelligence service such as CSIS fitting in, and what powers they ought to have under their mandate to protect Canadian security.
Malheureusement, je dois...
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We'll go now to Mr. Motz. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I will ask my first set of questions to our guests who are here in the committee with us today. Now, we heard from the Center for Jewish and Israeli and Jewish Affairs that the proposed changes on the promotion and advocacy of terrorism effectively makes the change to the criminal code, some redundancy, and yet we need to ensure that those promoting lone wolf attacks are stopped from promoting violence and hate. Now, are the changes that are proposed on the promotion and advocacy of terrorism to counseling a fundamental shift from that? I know you spoke about it earlier, sir. Is there anything more you want to add on that?
Well, I mean, right now, I mean, I think the government has identified a real problem. There's no prosecutions. But I don't think the problem is the wording in the law. In fact, the wording in the law we have now, I think, is preferable to the wording that the government proposes. I think that there's a different way of dealing with this problem. And I don't see the problem being solved by changing the law to more restrictive wording, because I don't see the problem existing in the wording in the law. In fact, it sends a counterintuitive message that we're stepping back from directly addressing this problem. And I think we have to think of ways of moving forward rather than stepping back.
For the sake of time, I'm not going to pursue it, but I'm really interested to know what you think those solutions might be for another day.
Well, I mean, I did try to indicate at least some of them in my brief. Education, training, signing the convention, guidelines, working with other countries. We are dealing, I would say, with terrorism, with I mean, not just incitement, but terrorism generally, with a relatively new phenomenon. And as a result, it requires a form of expertise that the prosecution and investigation and police authorities haven't traditionally had. But I don't see that the development of that experience and ability to use the law being affected by changing the law. I think it has to lie elsewhere.
Okay.
And sorry, if I could just add to that, we need to ensure that conceptually there's no narrowing, so that our security agencies can properly deal with the threats of terrorism today and the threats of terrorism that exist tomorrow. And on the Justice Canada website right now, in a description of Bill C-51 discussing the criminalization of the advocacy or promotion of terrorism offenses in general, it states that it is directed at prohibiting the active encouragement of the commission of terrorism offenses and not mere expressions of opinion about the acceptability of terrorism. A sentence later, it states, it extended the concept of counseling to cases where no specific terrorism offense is being counseled, but it is evident nonetheless that terrorism offenses are being counseled. So I think we need to be careful about narrowing it so that we're handcuffing our security apparatus from dealing with the threats of terrorism into the future.
So to properly, I guess, understand for me is you're suggesting that the language in the former C-51 might actually serve national security interests better than the proposed language in C-59?
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Mostyn, in testimony in Canada's national security framework, you said that, and I quote, "The Jewish community is particularly vulnerable to hate propaganda throughout the world, and many of the most powerful terrorist organizations in existence today, such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and Daesh, rely upon the promotion of hatred with particular focus on anti-Semitism to inspire acts of terror," end quote. As we know, we don't have to look very far in time to see a place where this is very much the case, and is still the case. And from the attacks on supermarkets in Paris, the endless calls for the death of Jews in the Democratic State of Israel by regimes like Iran. So when we think of those sort of real-life examples, does this bill go far enough? Does it do enough to protect Canadians and its minority communities against radical Islam terrorism?
Well, I think, as Mr. Maida stated earlier, I don't think any law, no matter how it's worded, is going to protect Canadians. It's how it's interpreted, and it's at the end of the day, it's the training, it's the education of our law enforcement agencies, how they work together, how they work with their international partners, understanding the threats, understanding the new coded language of those threats, which it doesn't appear that all law enforcement agencies in Canada are familiar with. It changes. Sometimes there's religious nuances, and this needs to be understood because, for example, guns and gangs, many police forces have these divisions across the country. They speak in coded languages. They don't speak in ordinary English. So we need to understand that language, and that is something that's an educational exercise, that's a training exercise, not necessarily something that might be covered in legislation, per se.
So I appreciate your comment that the law itself doesn't necessarily make this, it's the application of it that will add to national security, and I appreciate those comments. You had said earlier in follow up to my colleagues' questions, you spoke of the link between hate and terrorism, and if I understood you, you're suggesting that then all terrorism or terrorism generally is rooted in hate?
Well, terrorism has to come from a place of hate. For any individual to go out and perform such heinous, murderous violence, there has to be seething hatred inside of them, and that's a pathway. Sometimes it can happen very, very quickly. Sometimes it can get extended out. But there's going to be various moments in time, trigger points, and influencers on individuals. Individuals who are more vulnerable tend to be targeted by this radicalization. But at the end of the day, yes, it's based in hatred. It's based in dehumanization of identifiable groups. Absolutely.
This is for both the guests here and you, Professor Nesbitt, as well. I'd like to know, under Part 5 of this bill, Clause 114, I quote, "Any form of advocacy, protest, dissent, or artistic expression is not an activity that undermines the security of Canada." Now, is there a risk that including this language may potentially present loopholes that the authors of the bill may not have considered at the time, which may indeed present a risk to the security of Canada and Canadians?
That provision's already in the law, if I remember correctly. So what you're asking about is should it continue to be there?
Yes. It's in a different form in 59 than it is in 51, if I am correct.
Yes. Well, I mean, right now that's a theoretical concern. I mean, if we had an actual prosecution which was stopped by that language, which we feel shouldn't have been stopped, then we would say yes. But right now, I mean, we're at a state where, or if the government said, well, we feel that language is what's inhibiting us, then we would say yes also. But that's not what the government is saying. It's saying they're concerned about the punitive sections, not the defense sections. I should say that this is a problem that we've seen with the police and administration of justice with hate offenses, and now police have a lot of hate crime unit. We've seen it with sexual assault offenses, and now police are becoming more sensitized to this. I really think that what we need to do is make this work. And okay, if it's not working with the language we have, then we can change it. But to sort of, before we even start making it work, to try to change the language, in my view, just, well, both our views sends the wrong signal.
Okay, Mr. Nesbitt?
I'd have to look at the precise language and compare it to the Supreme Court, but my sense is that is just implementing Supreme Court requirements with respect to this sort of crime, in particular hate speech. So this is making it charter compliant and doing not a whole lot more than that. In fact, without this, I think there was concerns that we would not have a charter compliant law.
Thank you. Professor Nesbitt, you said in your testimony on the National Security Review that you suggested there needed to be better coordination of agencies and organizations. Is this achieved here in 59, and do you see the new NCA-IRA as an ideal group to conduct the centralized information collection and analysis, and then to put together in a bigger picture?
Yeah, I'm quite supportive of both the new review bodies and the Intelligence Commissioner oversight. I think, as I said during that testimony as well, I think this is not just me speaking as a lawyer talking about the promotion of liberties and rights and laws in Canada. This is me speaking as someone who has worked in government and seen the benefit of having outside review to the efficaciousness of internal operations. And so I guess my biggest concern will not be legal, but will be with respect to resourcing. So if the resources are there to get into the weeds specifically and to consider the operations of those agencies when certain matters are considered, then I think this could be very beneficial. But again, that will probably come down to, at least as far as I can tell so far, resourcing at this point.
And a follow-up, in 2015, an article you authored for the National Post, you wrote that Canada cannot claim to have taken the threat of ISIL funding seriously in the way the U.S. has. Canada's sanctions, legislation, and enforcement are outdated, underfunded, and limited in scope. Now, does C-59 address this issue of terrorist group funding in a meaningful way?
No, actually, that's one of the concerns that I continue to have with respect to our national security laws. And that is when we have done prosecution on terrorist group funding, there's been one example under our Special Economics Measures Act, so our sanctions, and one or two under our criminal code. So we have very few examples of Canada taking this particularly seriously, and that's despite the fact that we have ample evidence from foreign organizations, including the CIA, for example, saying that Canada is at risk of being a home to terrorist financing and other sanctions-busting activities. One of the things that at some point they will have to look at is more than just the Magnitsky Act as it went through, but the Special Economics Measures Act in particular, and how we're dealing with terrorist funding through, frankly, foreign affairs, which has our suppression of terrorist regulations, which are crimes under their purview, and our economic sanctions for Russia, North Korea, Syria, Iraq, and others.
Suggest then that there might be opportunity to strengthen C-59 by adding some provisions in that have to do with this specifically?
Yeah, I don't know whether I wouldn't want to tell you folks how to do your job, but
but that's why you're here. No, sir, you're here to give us advice based on your experience on how to properly, in your opinion, address this issue of national security and public safety. And I mean, we have the unique opportunity to have this bill before committee before second reading. So
sure.
It's purposeful to ask experts to tell us what we're missing. And
right. So I'll tell you my only concern with that is not at all with the question you're asking, which is, do we need to do something more? Absolutely. Does it need to be legislated? Absolutely. Do we need significant oversight by the NSIRA over the foreign affairs operations of and CBSA operations here? Absolutely. Whether that should be in what is already a very long omnibus bill, that's where I'm sort of more tentative whether you want to add language to this bill or a different bill. But in general, I would be very supportive of seeing increased oversight and attention to this issue.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Motz. Now, Ms. Damoff, 7 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Our witnesses for, or all three of our witnesses for being here today. And I believe you were here when we were studying the national security framework the last time. I seem to recall being on a panel, both of you actually, when we were looking at that. So I appreciate you coming back. And it always concerns me when our discussion on terrorist attacks solely focus on ISIS and don't focus on the attacks on our Muslim community and the right-wing attacks. And that has come up because I mentioned, I think when you were here last time, that I'm always struck when there is an attack on the Muslim community that the first people to step up is the Jewish community. And I think it's because of that long history of hatred towards the Jewish community that you recognize the impact. And I know certainly in my own community, there's Halton Interfaith Council, there's tremendous cooperation, and it is the Jewish community who's the first to always step up when there is an attack on the Muslim community. So I just want to thank you for that and make sure that our conversation is on the broader terrorism threat, not just on ISIL. We had not just the minister, and this is directed to B'nai B'rith, because you were talking about advocacy versus counseling. When we had law enforcement here, and I believe there were other witnesses as well, although I don't recall for sure, they said that they agreed with what the minister said in terms of the ability to prosecute, that advocacy did not give them the tools that they needed, and that counseling actually would give them the tools to go out to get those prosecutions. So I'm wondering if you saw that testimony and if you would agree with what they were saying. So I'll put that to both of you just quickly.
Well, the answer in terms of whether I agree is no, because as I pointed out previously, the offense of counseling for terrorist activity already is there in the criminal code. It's a different section. It's not 83.221. I think it's 83.01B2, but it's there. And if all they needed was the offense of counseling to go ahead, they could have used that provision. They didn't have to get a change in the law. And the fact that they didn't do it, even though it's already there, doesn't give me much confidence that, as I said, just reenact it, saying it twice in two different parts of the criminal code is going to do much. I think the problem lies elsewhere. Is basically they're just not used to dealing with terrorism. It's not a traditional expertise within the police force.
Right.
They really have to develop a specialized expertise that can address it.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Nesbitt, did you have anything to add to that?
No, just in general, I'd say for a long, long, long time in Section 22 of the Criminal Code, we have had a counseling of offense, which is to say it's an offense to counsel another offense within the criminal code. And in fact, we've had at least two that I can think of terrorist prosecutions that have actually included counseling offenses, though not counseling in the sense that we're thinking of it here, but counseling the participation in a terrorist group or counseling the facilitation of a terrorist activity. This is, as far as I can tell, redundant to Section 22 of the criminal code.
Thank you. In terms of potential amendments to the bill, we've heard about the difficulties that law and enforcement agencies have when crucial information isn't shared in a timely and efficient manner. And we heard that during our testimony on the National Security Framework. So do you think the creation of the new National Security and Intelligence Review Agency will help to ensure that we're effectively sharing that information with other departments and countries in order to address terrorist threats more quickly and efficiently? And do you have any additional suggestions on how we might improve the efficiency between our intelligence and law enforcement agencies? So I'll put that, maybe Professor Nesbitt, you can start this time and then we'll turn it over.
Sure, I think so you're asking about the new review agency and whether that will...
Well, that will assist with the information sharing, because we've heard that the information isn't shared between agencies in a timely manner, and so it ties their hands in terms of not getting the information quickly enough. So do you think this will assist with that? And also, do you have any additional suggestions to help with that process?
Sure. So let me start by saying I, at least in my experience, and this is now drawing a little bit more on my experience than my studies, but in my experience, one of the big problems with information sharing in government was always cultural. Certainly there was a need to open up more information sharing. The avenues of information sharing could sometimes be overly bureaucratic, but often it was cultural. And this is, it harkens back to the previous answer I gave, which is one of the benefits of this review agency is that it can look at the totality of the approach within government to something like, again, to harken back to this, but sanctions, right? So sanctions are done at foreign affairs, but CBSA is obviously involved if we're talking about goods going out of or into in Canada. FinTrack could be involved, CSIS could be involved, et cetera. So how would a review agency help with the sharing of information? Well, if they're looking across departments at those various organizations in a way that the organizations themselves are not, as they remain siloed, it will force those organizations to then do the same. It can bring together some of this activity. So I'm actually very supportive and very encouraged by that opportunity. I hope it is taken up in practice.
I have less than a minute left. Did you gentlemen have anything to add to that, or is that good? Okay. All right. Thank you. I've only got 30 seconds left. I don't think there's time to ask and answer, so I'll end there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Ms. Dama. Now, Mr. Mott for 5.
Thank you again for being here. I want to just take a little bit off from what my colleague, Ms. Damoff, was talking about. You had mentioned in your previous testimony, Mr. Nesbitt, I believe it was, that the culture of security agencies to protect information is a barrier to centralized information or centralizing information, and that ensuring that the right information gets to the right people in a timely manner is problematic. Now, would you say that C-59 is well placed to deal with this issue, and that is that this mandatory reporting agency that compels information rather than sits back and waits? Are we dealing with this right with respect to how C-59 is going to, the mechanism and how it's going to play out?
It's a good question, frankly. I would start by saying I do have some concerns with the changes or lack thereof to the part of the act that deals with information sharing itself, which is that I won't get into details, you've heard this from others, but that the definition of threat to security of Canada is not the definition that exists in CSIS, but a new and very broad definition. So I don't think that is the right approach to answer. But more broadly, I think the benefit to what is happening now is that we're looking at information sharing more holistically. So we're not just talking about opening up the avenues to information sharing within government, but we're also looking at how it can be encouraged culturally, right? How review across agencies can break down the silos of review and then hopefully break down the silos of information sharing. It can force people to, if the job is done correctly, get in the same room, which is often a problem within any large organization, really. So I think there are lots of, I'd have to think more closely about whether there's anything else we could do. I hadn't, frankly, prepared for that. And I'd be happy to get back to you on that if that's of interest. But I think for now, this is a very good start. I'm heartened to see a lot of the details in the bill.
And if you have more suggestions, I would think the committee would be open to receiving those. That would be great. Thank you. We do know that, to the guests that are here, the committee has heard that terrorist groups will continue to operate and coordinate and recruit online. And I guess we do also know that there's a rise in online hate. Do you think this bill goes far enough to deal, and you had said previously that terrorism is rooted in hatred. Does this bill go far enough to deal with the online hate and to limit that in some degree? And Mr. Nesbitt, please feel free to join us in your comments.
I'm not aware of anything that, in terms of the bill that deals specifically with the internet in relation to advocacy, promotion, counseling. I know that there used to be something in the Canadian Human Rights Act, Section 13.1, that dealt specifically with the internet, which was repealed, and we realized it was problematic, and what we were proposing is a repeal and reenactment with the problems removed, but it just disappeared. And I think that the internet is pervasive enough, problematic enough, it presents its own very specific problems, that it would be worthwhile developing some specific legislation that's dealing with it. I mean, part of the facet of the of the internet is it's a commercial network of contracts, which often have good standards which aren't being enforced. And so there is a question of the extent to which those standards, the mechanisms should be developed for enforcing those standards. I mean, it may be too much to do all that in the context of amendment of this bill, but I really think it's something that this committee and this government should be looking at very specifically.
Professor Nesbitt?
To my mind, the biggest barrier to enforcement and prosecution of that the terrorist act to which you speak, or any terrorist act, is the so-called problem with intelligence to evidence. And so I understand that the bureaucracy or the government may be thinking about dealing with that in the future. And I would say if this is what we are concerned about, then something we will have to tackle in the near future is this intelligence to evidence problem, which involves the collection by security agencies of information and how it can be properly and legally shared and safely shared with the RCMP for the purposes of actually enforcing the laws that we do have on the books, which are fairly comprehensive.
Thank you very much, both.
Merci, Monsieur Motz.
Mr. Motz. Mr. Spingelman, 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Mr. Mostyn and Mr. Matus.
An overview of the strategic threats assessment that this bill is situated in. It's called the National Security Act. It's broad. It's supposed to encompass any threats that come our way. The committee heard a lot about cyber threats. It heard a lot about terrorism and radicalization and violence. Is that the entire basket? Are there others? And how would you rank the two in relative proportion to each other vis-a-vis your own concerns?
There's obviously those are very strong threats. There are other threats. I mean, there's radicalization just doesn't take place online. It does take place by individuals, even here in Canada, and that's why. With the lack of prosecutions, there's also a lack of cases that are going up the way from police forces. So the real question is, how do we deal with that? B'nai B'rith itself has exposed situations, rallies publicly, where there has been just vile hate speech being spoken in the streets, often with children, sometimes children that are kept home by their parents. To listen to this and that are chanting slogans themselves. There are institutions that have charitable status in this country that are posting on their own YouTube channels. Again, hatred, targeting identifiable group, Zionists. B'nai B'rith exposed the MAC, which has charitable status in Vancouver. They had an imam up there, was on their YouTube channel. We complained to CRA, and they were calling Israelis an impure gang and Zionists the worst of mankind. So there's a lot of evidence out there of incidents happening here in Canada, and I think that not just the Jewish community, but all identifiable groups in this country want to see the law upheld and justice be done, and the protection of our society when there are, real incidents of groups being targeted for hate.
This will be a complex question and answer, but to what extent are these concerns linked to international terrorist organizations like ISIS, like Al-Shabaab, like Abu Sayyaf, who are preying primarily, almost exclusively on young people downside of the age of 30? Are the domestic threats here generated in Canada, or are they strongly linked to what's going on outside our borders?
Well, I mean, obviously there's both, but I think we have to look at the intermediaries, because a lot of this communication is obviously done through the internet. So the question is, what is the responsibility of the means of communication? If it was in a newspaper, it would be easy because we have laws developed about that. But when it comes to the internet intermediaries, they are mostly considered not responsible, and you have to sort of go to the source, which gets you, where is the source? Whereas all, of course, these internet companies that are communicate this have presences in Canada. And so I think one of the things that when you're dealing with this problem is looking more closely at the responsibility of the intermediaries in dealing with this issue.
Thank you very much. Time is very limited. I wanted to ask you about the relative importance of the counterterrorism, counter-violence work, your expectations of the Center for Community Engagement and Prevention of Violence in juxtaposition to the law enforcement, criminalization, and prosecution framework that is also that we're building, and that's also very important. How does the former compare to the latter?
Well, I mean, B'nai B'rith, we're very supportive of that initiative, and we look forward to working closer with them. And I think they should engage with with many civil society groups. You're right. It's the other side of the coin when you're talking about prevention, and that has to be taken care of in addition to obviously the.
Do you have some precise expectations or ideas or a framework for that center?
We're in dialogue with them, and we'd be happy to provide some further information to you.
That would be helpful to the committee.
Okay,
I think that's it,
certainly.
Mr. Chair. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Spiegelman. Mr. Nesbitt, and Mr. Marston, Mr. Matus, thank you for appearing here before the committee today.